You're about to find out how your cell phone works, how your garage remote works, and how every radio frequency in South Africa is transmitted. The big question is, should government auction off that radio frequency spectrum to give private sector players ownership, or should there be a national broadband wholesale provider? An Eskom of broadband, if you like. That's an horrific thought. But which side of the spectrum do cell phone providers fall on? This is the MoneyMakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight I'm joined by Cell C's legal chief officer, or chief legal officer, Graham Mackinnon, and MTN's chief of corporate services, Graham Vries, to talk about what's at play. Give me a sense first to this concept of spectrum. If we look at an old-fashioned wireless with a radio and a dial, is that the extent of spectrum from 94 to 110 megahertz or whatever the case is? Well, it's got to be bigger than that.
Yeah. Bruce, forgive me, I'm a lawyer, so I'll try and explain it as a lawyer can, a very technical concept. But basically,
I'm just getting my pose right.
Okay, spectrum is really the airwaves, if you want,
Yep.
over which signals are transmitted. So you essentially have broadcasters that want to transmit over spectrum, and also mobile operators. And other players.
So police officers and security companies and virtually everybody who wants to communicate using a wireless connection.
Correct. And spectrum has different frequencies. There's bandwidth, so you have different frequencies which are more suitable or less suitable depending on what type of service you want to offer. So for example, the mobile operators, the typical frequencies that they like to transmit in is the 900 megahertz, the 1800 megahertz, and the 2100 megahertz bands.
Is that a quality consideration?
It's a quality, and it also has to do with the length of the actual radio wave.
Okay.
So for example, in the 900, the radio wave is slightly shorter. It has better capabilities to penetrate buildings, whereas a longer frequency, say the 2100, can spread better over a greater area.
Is he doing well, Graham? Is he doing well in terms of explaining frequency?
Indeed.
Okay,
so
no, just
frequency it exists, it's part of science, we can't manufacture it, it is there.
And it's limited.
And it's a limited resource.
Now, from 0 to 1,000, how big is spectrum?
Again, a very technical question for two lawyers around the
Yeah.
table.
But I mean, but again, if it was 1 liter jug full of water, once you've poured out all the water, the spectrum is finished. You cannot have any more spectrum, and that spectrum, as I understand it, is fairly clogged as things stand right now with emergency services and cell phone operators and even garage door remotes.
So that is the reason why there are frequency allocations done by ICASA, so that everybody knows in terms of the frequency licenses that are assigned by ICASA, which particular frequency, which particular operator could utilize. So for instance, whilst Cell C and Vodacom and MTN all operate in 900, 1800 and 2100, they all have different parts of that particular frequency as assigned by ICASA so that they don't interfere with one another.
Okay, so we've got those little bits of frequency. Now, are those, a bit like a broadband pipe perhaps, are those frequencies clogged? Is there a problem with spectrum?
So yeah, maybe I can explain. Basically, the more spectrum you have, the greater the more bandwidth that's assigned to you, the greater the throughput. So it has a lot to do with speed. So the more you have, the better speeds you can offer to your customers. So the more customers you have, and the more, as you say, clogged it becomes, it does become an issue eventually when you have enough.
And that explains calls getting dropped, for example, or not?
Yeah, it's a quality issue. Okay. So it's a throughput issue and a quality issue.
So suddenly your signal is compressed. You might have the call breaking up, as so often can happen in a cell phone call, for example.
Yeah, it doesn't happen a lot on Cell C, but I know what you mean. Yes.
You've heard about it. You've heard the rumor that it happens on other networks. Okay, so here we've got a spectrum. Who decides how much you get? This is an ICASA thing. So do you, as MTN, have more than Cell C because you have more customers? How does that work?
At this moment in time, it's on a first-come, first-served basis in terms of the current frequency assignments. But at the moment, there are no differences between what MTN and Cell C has. So we've got exactly the same amount of frequency, both in 900, 1800, as well as 2100.
So theoretically, their signal should be better than yours because it's less polluted, it's less clogged.
It's not as simple as that, because it also depends on as Graham had said, in terms of the throughput, in terms of what kind of services you offer. So it's not only related to market share at all. So it also relates to the number of base stations that you do have. So as a result of the lack of frequency, if I can put it that way, or the non-assignment of frequency by ICASA, what we are doing as mobile operators, we are densifying our networks. So what we are doing is we're rolling out more and more technologies and more base stations to take up the slack, so to speak.
And that's expensive.
It is very expensive because base stations and the rollout of physical base stations are a time-consuming exercise. You also have to have local authority approvals,
And
etc.
you've got communities that don't like base stations.
That is there as well.
Yeah.
So it is far more efficient for any mobile operator to actually utilize its current infrastructure and place on top of that particular mobile infrastructure a larger spectrum assignment.
Okay,
that is
why is there not more spectrum available? This Graham.
The reason is because, as you said, it's a scarce resource. It just isn't available. But there is some available. And for example, what's happening is the broadcasters currently are sitting on a very valuable 800 band, which should become available once they move from analog to digital. I don't know if you know, but there's been a whole fight around set-top boxes and that's been holding it up.
We're 10 years overdue on set-top boxes.
We're very overdue. But basically, when that becomes available, that's a very valuable band that the mobile operators can utilize. And there's 60 megahertz available in that band. But
and in English, so what
that
60
means,
megahertz
it's not
could
a
be
lot.
60
It's
kilowatts.
not a lot.
Yeah.
And what I said earlier is the more you have, the better throughputs you can achieve. So, for example, the new technologies that are coming out currently in South Africa, we kind of hitting 4G. There's a debate about what actually these things mean, 4G, but we're moving to 4.5, 5G. And these technologies are currently available, for example, in China. The Chinese vendors who make all the equipment have the stuff, but you need massive amounts of spectrum to be able to actually to use it.
Okay, so at the moment, ICASA doles out spectrum. It gives equal amounts of spectrum to everybody, and I'm assuming you pay for the
You pay a
use
license fee, an annual license fee for that spectrum.
use of that spectrum.
Yes.
Why can this new spectrum not simply be spread out in the same way as previously?
I think the reason is because there's lots of people that want it. Because it's a scarce resource, it's not just the Cell C, the MTN, the Vodacom, and the Telkom that want it. There are lots of other players that are actually saying that they should have a slice of the action. So,
So it should go into a public auction. You should get everybody who wants a piece of the spectrum and knock down to the highest bidder, or not?
Yeah, well, Bruce, there's competing views on this, and this is where it gets interesting. So government have policies that they draft, and which ICASA really needs to fit its regulations to adapt to suit those policies. And you can't have, for example, you might have a small player who doesn't have the resources to bid massive amounts at an auction. But government may feel for policy reasons that they're entitled to some part of that.
So what you're saying, I'm just going to translate this into English, as Cell C is the number 3 player in South Africa, you would feel like you would lose out to the big bully boys of Vodacom and MTN, who've got far more, well, MTN not so much, they've got to pay a lot to the Nigerians, but Vodacom may very well get that spectrum if there was a tussle for the highest bidder.
Correct. So it's not just that. I think it's also around efficiency. So what I was saying earlier, if you're using 5G technology, for example, you need something like 55 megahertz to have a really great network. So what I was saying is you've got only 60 available in the 800 megahertz band. So if you split that between 4, for example, you would only each have 15. So you're not really future-proofing the spectrum for future technologies.
So what is Cell C's solution to the problem?
So Cell C's solution is we suggesting that they have what's called a national broadband network, but we're not suggesting that they give it to an Eskom, as you suggested earlier, and even to a Telkom. With all due respect to our friends from Telkom, they don't have a great track record, we believe. But we think that there's another model, and it would involve some kind of private-public partnership. And basically the spectrum would be assigned to a wholesale provider and people would participate in that. It would have to obviously be strictly regulated. You would need wholesale prices that are carefully regulated, service level agreements, etc.
But then everybody would use that same 55 megahertz spectrum then?
Correct. And currently in line with the SA Connect, which is the national broadband policy, where they want to have service-based competition as opposed to infrastructure-based competition, people would compete on services and not on infrastructure.
Graham, why do I think that you probably disagree with Graham on this particular point?
And you would be correct.
Why?
We favor a view that there has to be some form of competition. So there are regulators out and policymakers that want to experiment with certain market structures. And a single wholesale broadband network sounds very suspiciously like a monopoly because there will only be one. And monopolists charge monopoly prices. There's a lack of innovation.
You can sort that out with tight regulation, can't you?
And therein lies the difficulty, is because tight regulation, we're in this phase of we have liberalized the market. So it seems to be very counterintuitive that after 20 years of liberalizing the market, of competing network infrastructure,
it could be argued you just
etc.
don't want them to have equal access to spectrum.
In fact, that is not the case. If you look at an information memorandum that ICASA brought out not so long ago, and there's a slight controversy over, is that there will be enough spectrum for four players. So in that particular environment, again, there would be enough spectrum to make sure that you can actually have a very viable business.
So would you like to see go out an auction or go out to tender and say there is 55 megs of spectrum available? How much you prepare to pay for it, going at X billion, squillion per meg?
Well, frequency auction is definitely a very efficient way to assign frequency spectrum. It has been proven across the world, Europe, the US, etc. now, that frequency auctions actually is a very efficient way to assign frequency spectrum. And we would actually look at frequency spectrum, and we've been part of frequency spectrum assignments in other parts of Africa where we have. So we would favor a frequency spectrum auction.
But again, auction for life, or do you get the right to use that frequency for a period of time before you then have to reapply for it?
Well, when you actually do frequency auctions and not on the current basis where we actually have to renew our frequency licenses on a yearly basis, you actually get that frequency for the price that you then pay for the period of your license condition, correct.
Okay.
And normally that is anything between 15 to 20 years. There are some countries that have assigned it for 25 years.
Why, Graham, is Graham's idea a bad idea?
Because auctions also have their pitfalls. One of them is that people overpay for the spectrum because it's obviously a competitive bidding process. No, it's not their problem, because what they have to do is recover that cost, and the way they recover it is they pass that straight to the consumer. And because they're the only ones with the spectrum, they will basically have a monopoly or duopoly or whatever it is, and they will just pass that cost straight. So
when do we get a resolution on this? When is a decision taken on this?
That's a difficult question.
Within a year, 12. So it's all about getting TV from terrestrial to digital. That's the first thing.
One aspect, and there is
so it's never going to happen.
And also, government is in the process. We're led to believe that it's a month away or so from actually formulating formally their policy, and then ICASA can take that policy and then issue regulations to allocate spectrum.
Fabulous discussion, Graham. Thank you. Graham, thank you very much. MTN's Chief of Corporate Services is Graham de Vries, and Cell C's Chief Legal Officer, Graham Mackinnon. Two opposing views as to how best to divvy up a scarce resource. It's the curse of South Africa, of course, where we have limited resources in practically everything. What is the best way to do it? Well, time will tell. There'll be more bottom line issues to deal with tomorrow. Right now, though, it's good night from us. Bye-bye.